Our first speaker for today is Mr. Barrington Greenidge, Chief Opposition Spokesperson on Finance. Thank you, Mr. Greenidge.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and may I take the opportunity to express the wish that colleagues would have had an enjoyable Easter and are suitably rejuvenated to help us through the exercise that is before us this week and the following week. And thank you also for giving me my full title. Mr. Speaker, colleagues, I'd like to start by thanking the Minister of Finance for giving us on Monday the 25th a most interesting budget presentation, a presentation itself which I believe was full of what I might call sleights of hand and little tricks. We had a budget opportunity that would have enabled us, I think, to address a number of very important issues before the country. And rather than taking the opportunity to deal with them frontally, we did some other things. Let me say that even a cursory reading of the recent social and political history of Guyana would reveal that a general consensus exists around the fact that whatever might be the government's claims as regards economic statistics, Guyana is facing severe problems that warrant attention. These problems include a very high and socially dysfunctional rate of unemployment. And that high rate persists in spite of an unprecedented flight of Guyanese from these shores. A flight which has left us in a situation where we started off in the early 60s with a population similar to that of Trinidad and Tobago. And now our own population struggles to be half of that of Trinidad and Tobago. The problems faced by Guyana that contribute to that flight include simmering communal and other tensions, one of the highest rates of suicide in the world, a growing army of destitute and mentally ill persons on our streets, along with hordes of unskilled and often hopeless youths. And no one visiting Guyana within the last 15 years has failed to notice the impending environmental and public health catastrophe associated with what appears to be a calculated policy to dispose of solid waste in public spaces and waterways in a manner that defies civilized public health standards and practices. The APNU in particular continues to vigorously draw to the government's attention the need to address these burning issues. Indeed, I think we never miss an opportunity. The calls have generally been resolutely ignored. And in the run-up to the minister's laying of the 2012 appropriation bill, the opposition parties agreed amongst themselves, that is the APNU and FC, that they would only support a budget which addressed these key concerns. In their discussions, they called on the PPP and government representatives to attend to these burning issues. And in the preliminaries, which is all we had, of the 2013 tripartite talks, these are the talks that never materialized, the points were again raised. But since many, I think, commentators, partisan and non-partisan, seem to forget that the two parties have at various points announced priorities that they felt should be addressed. Let me just remind the House, Mr. Speaker, that the joint APNUFC agreement, which formed in part the backbone to the discussions that took place in 2012, as I mentioned, made it clear that the budget in its form of that we saw in 2012 didn't meet the demands for changes to stimulate growth, to lower the cost of living, and improve the quality of life for ordinary people. And those remain a major concern of certainly of the APNU, and the AFC will speak for themselves. The opposition's demands at that time were a reduction in the value of the tax, the reduction and changed arrangements for the bodies, river, bridge, toll rate, an increase in the salaries of public servants, increases in the subvention to the University of Guyana, increases in the retirement age of public servants, a removal of the constitutional offices from the schedule of budgetary agencies captured in the Fiscal Management and Accountability Act. And they would include GCOM, the Service Commission, the courts, DPP, Auditor General, and so forth. The call for the government to restructure GAISUCO and GPL so as to convert them into viable corporations that could contribute in a meaningful way to the development and the exploitation of our productive capacity. The need to restructure NISL and to bring its financial assets within the ambit of the Consolidated Fund, and to restructure GINA and NCN to make them into responsible national institutions. I might also add that the parties also urged the government to establish, without delay, the National Procurement Commission. Mr. Speaker, there has been very little discussion of most of these matters in the budget statement itself, and even less provision in the estimates. So before I turn to some of the specifics mentioned by the Honourable Minister in the budget statement, I'd like to touch on some of these areas. And I start with a comment or a set of comments on the question of poverty and pro-poor policies. The proposals coming from the APNU in terms of poverty and the need to alleviate and reduce poverty and the growing income inequality in Guyana was supported by findings from several studies. Those studies, including one prepared by the World Bank, published in 2003, argue that in addition to the out-migration, or like emigration of skilled workers, and declines in economic growth, declines in domestic and foreign investment, the declines in Guyana's economic growth between 1998 and 2004 were partly due to less favorable political and institutional environment after 1997. And they argue that investment is needed, but it is impeded by a number of factors, some of which appear in the most recent report on the ease of doing business in the Caribbean, in the world, in which Guyana features. They argue that investment, for example, is impeded by a complex regulatory framework, and that the enforceability of laws remains limited in Guyana. Beyond weaknesses in legal and institutional arrangements, they note that the polarized nature of Guyanese society is a continuing source of violence, and that also acts as a disincentive to investment. But really what I'm trying to emphasize here is that the analysis underlines or underscores the role that institutional weaknesses play in hindering the effectiveness of the policies which are fashioned and intended to enhance growth and development. And the bank, in looking at the debt relief initiatives that it had helped to lead on Guyana's behalf, pointed at that time to the fact that these institutional weaknesses were hindering the effectiveness of the debt relief initiative. And it included a weak capacity to plan, implement, and manage development policies. And they emphasized the lack of skilled personnel. So the importance of institutional capacity, I think, is one that we cannot exaggerate. And in the light of that, one would hope and would have hoped that the budget would pay some special attention to building the human resource base, strengthening human resource capacity in Guyana, and in that way not only increasing the quality of the human resources we have, but trying to attenuate the flight of skills which has characterized us for so long in the region. But when we had some discussion on this in the past, there was, I think, a justifiable claim on the government side that they had policies in the past, the PRSP in particular, which reflected an agreed approach to poverty alleviation. And that approach had been one agreed between the donors and the government of Guyana. But more recently, as this budget itself shows, there is or has been something of a lack of attention to poverty and poverty alleviation in the approach of the government. And that has been, I think, especially the case since the so-called national competitiveness strategy. It's taken the emphasis away from issues of poverty alleviation and put them elsewhere, when in reality these ought to be complementary strategies and should not be at the expense of dealing with poverty, especially at a time when inequalities and, as I say, destitution in the streets seems to be growing almost daily. The APNU itself had expected that a pro-poor policy program would have been a significant pillar of government policy. In fact, when the government of Guyana was seeking HIPIC assistance, it had agreed to give priority to a number of areas. And I'd like to mention them because, in my view, and I think in the view of many others, these areas still warrant priority attention. There were the projects that were captured, and these I think could be called poverty-oriented expenditure programs. There were projects executed under the Social Impact Amelioration Program, which of course had been launched prior to the accession of this government to office. There was a Basic Needs Trust Fund. There are elements of a poverty program administered by the Ministry of Finance. There's also a student loan program, and a number of the programs and projects within some of the sectors, such as agriculture, communications, the sanitation sector, I may emphasize, and the need for institutional strengthening in a number of these areas. It perhaps is worth mentioning that as the millennium developed, pro-poor spending fluctuated. And it fluctuated because the priority to poverty was concentrated on a few programs, these that I've listed. But the thing is that these programs were funded primarily by external donors. And to the extent that the donors' funding to these agencies have declined in recent times, the importance of these projects seem also to have declined commensurately. And what I'm saying, Mr. Speaker, is that the decline in the emphasis given to the pro-poor package is entirely attributable to government's policy, the policy of the government and its advisors, which policy exhibits a preoccupation with flagship projects, large, lumpy, prestige projects, rather than projects that address the critical issues that are before us. The government seems to feel that dealing with poverty is not their responsibility. It is the responsibility of the foreign and donor community. So, as a consequence, when those donor funds have been reduced, the projects of this type have been denied funds. The government has, in other words, failed to compensate the change composition of the donor package. And in the process, the poor have been elected. Mr. Speaker, in the work that we have been doing over the last 14 to 15 months, there is continuing public concern with this issue of poverty, the related issue of unemployment, and a recognition and acknowledgement, a clamoring for institutional reforms that could help us to attenuate these problems. These concerns outside seem to find no resonance with the PPP leadership, none at all. The second observation I'd like to touch on, because it has not been discussed in any significant way in the budget presentation, has to do with the debate on taxation and the value-added tax in particular. As a result of the tripartite discussions last March, President Rambutar had agreed to establish a committee to look at the opposition's request for a reduction in VAT rates, and that was to be treated as part of an overall review of the incidence of the tax system on different groups. The committee, consisting of businessmen and at least one academic, was supposed to make recommendations in the light of these concerns. Of course, since the President set up that body, and relatively recently the Honorable Minister of Finance has publicly rejected calls for reduction in VAT. And in that regard, he was joined by the Director General of the GRA in putting forward a most spurious and ill-founded argument to the effect that a VAT reduction will primarily affect businesses. The poor private sector, I might add, some of their spokesmen have swallowed this particular line, hook, line, and sinker, as they would say, and followed them along this line of argument. And they have even garnished it a bit with an even more alluring and selfless claim, I might add, namely that the VAT is a luxury tax, and therefore it is mainly borne by the rich. It's mainly borne by the rich, and for that reason the poor should be happy that it is in place and protecting them from the government. So the Private Sector Commission has been selling this idea as a complementary idea to the Minister's argument. Members, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to cite you a letter written by two members of an NGO, Red Thread in fact, because it's instructive and it points to how distant our policymakers are from the reality of what is in the street. Okay? and how distant they are from, if you like, the considerations governing the theory and policy of taxation. The writers, pointing to the impact of the tax on their daily purchases, state, and I quote, for example, at the cheapest price, one pack of chow mein costs $167 plus VAT, which is $26.72 extra. One pack of macaroni costs $150 plus VAT, which is $24 extra. And one 85-gram package of curry powder costs $92 plus VAT, which is $14.72 extra. But we not only need food, we need to iron our clothes. And the cheap iron costs $19.95 plus 16% VAT, which is $319 extra. We need to cook, and a 4-burner gas stove costs $36,000 plus VAT, which is $5,760 extra. We need to store our vegetables and meats, and a small fridge, 5.3 cubic feet in size, costs $59,999 plus VAT, which is $9,600 extra. We need a bed to sleep on, and a single bed costs $15,960 plus VAT, which is $2,554 extra. And a double bed costs $38,640 plus VAT, which is $6,182 extra. We need lights and the energy saver bulb, which we'll want to use to save money, costs $365 plus VAT. I understand that it's uncomfortable, which is $58 extra. The telephone bill also attracts VAT. Okay? Most of these extra costs look small, and I'm still quoting Mr. Speaker, but only to those whose incomes are large. Can I repeat that? Most of these extra costs look small, but only to those whose incomes are large. Imagine a single mother on public assistance who gets $5,900 subsequent to the 2012 budget, needing a kerosene stove at the cost of $1,512 plus VAT, which is $288 extra. And the 3 energy shaver bulbs at the cost of $1,095 plus a total of $174 for VAT. Mr. Speaker, the authors of the letter to the Stabroek News, published on April 5th, are making a fundamental point. It should be familiar, all single mothers don't want to work. Yes, Mr. Attorney General. It should be familiar to all second-year economics students, namely, that for low-income groups, characterized by a Guyanese earning $5,900 a month or $50,900 a month, the VAT is paid on almost all the entire income, since for obvious reasons, all that income will be spent on basics. Okay? Notwithstanding the zero-rated items or those attracting low rates, which include some unprocessed foods such as flour, as well as clothes and medicines, most of the purchases effected by the poor attract taxes. As may be seen from the foregoing example, the idea that VAT is a luxury tax is so ridiculous as to not merit further comment here. VAT and consumption taxes, Mr. Speaker, are termed regressive taxes and were initially not high in the priority list of economists, precisely because they bear more heavily on the lower than on the higher income groups. They are a greater burden on the lower than on the high income groups. And this means that they take a smaller proportion of the income of the well-off than they do of the poor. So it follows that the suggestion that a reduction of the tax would benefit the poor little, but will mainly be a benefit to the rich, is one that any second-year economics student would acquire a fail grade for proposing. The burden of taxes is measured not in absolute terms, but in proportional terms. And the argument that the tax which bears more heavily on the poor than on the rich will not benefit from the poor if reduced or lifted is one that I could not imagine a politician in Barbados or Jamaica making and surviving. In a way, Guyana is a blessed place. It's a blessed place for some. For those who miss the relevant lecture on public finance, the attraction of the VAT has nothing to do with its intrinsic value on equity grounds. That is, whether it's supposedly a greater burden upon the rich than on the poor. But because its base is every transaction, its base is every transaction, it is collected from a larger proportion of firms than any other tax, any other income tax of any type, or any consumption tax, single stage consumption tax. And therefore, the total amounts collected by VAT and those affected by it are far wider than the consumption tax that preceded it, which it replaced. And that is the issue, that's the strength of the VAT, not that it is more equitable. It is not more equitable, it is a regressive tax. And that has always been the case. As far as equity is concerned, however, because it is regressive and because it is inequitable, this tax normally is associated with a reform of other taxes. And the reform of those other taxes is intended to cushion the regressiveness, either by promoting more progressive taxes, but that has problems today in the way that we look at these tax burdens, or by way of specifically reducing those taxes that are normally borne by the poor. In other words, you try to compensate by reducing the taxes paid by those who are regarded as being less well off. And in Guyana, this was especially important because we had, under the ERP and subsequently, taken the step of removing a good deal of the progressiveness in our taxes, including in the personal income tax, with the arrangement that we have now, where it is a flat tax beyond a certain income level, and the same proportion is paid by everyone. And that is something that needs to be borne in mind, and that is why when the advisors to the Ministry of Finance looked at the question of the VAT, it was clearly understood and agreed at that time that the imposition of the VAT would be accompanied by the adjustment of other taxes. But, Mr. Speaker, the government, having introduced the VAT and realizing that the bulk of the poor are perhaps not their concern, has decided to abandon this second stage. And we saw that last year. The President offered to have the tax regime and the incidence of taxation on different groups examined by a group. We've not heard a beep from him since then. It is doubtful whether the committee has met. And the minister has not had the decency to even report to us as to the status of that committee and of the report. So we have nothing in the budget that tells us that the President doesn't hope that we have forgotten the pledge that he took to have the committee meet and report within the year 2012. So the structure of the taxation system, which was to have been modified, remains. And in the meantime, the businesses that are supposed to be so gallantly carrying this tax burden on behalf of the poor are busy, some of them, trying to dodge the burden of the tax by a range of devices, including the misclassification of a number of items so that they don't have to carry the impost. But Mr. Speaker, my grandmother was fond of saying that God don't sleep. There's an electorate out there, and it includes the poor, it includes those who pay VAT, and there will come a time when we have to turn to that election. And they will not forget this bad faith on the part of the PPP, on the part of the President in particular, and the PPP in general. So let us we will bear that in mind. Mr. Speaker, the regime in many ways, the PPP regime, continues to be in denial as regards these general issues of poverty, unemployment, and so forth that I've mentioned, and that the two opposition parties try to encourage them to examine. I would like to draw to the House's attention that we are being asked to look at an appropriation bill and estimates whilst the basic requirements of the Constitution are still the subject of infringement by the government. The Constitution, let me just remind you, and I know that some people are tired of hearing this, but let me just tell you, Mr. Speaker, that the Constitution, in relation to the format of the estimates, has something to say. And again, Article 222A, Article 222A says that in relation to the entities which are supposed to be independent, the constitutional entities, that the annual subvention should be reflected in the estimates by way of an annual subvention approved by the National Assembly after review, blah, blah, blah. Okay? So they're supposed to be part of a direct charge, and more specifically, they're supposed to be reflected as a lump sum in the estimates. The estimates I have before me, Mr. Speaker, the estimates I have before me, a matter on which the Chief Justice had something to say, and specifically had something to say, interestingly enough, about one of the few entities that is reflected in here that actually should be shown as a lump sum, is shown as a lump sum. The Ethnic Relations Committee. That's the one that's shown as a lump sum. And you will find that between pages 397 and 400, yeah, that the estimates show that none of the entities, well, not all the entities that are listed in the schedule, and including the audit office, are reflected as is the ERC and as is required by the Constitution. I hope I'm making myself clear. We are confronted by an administration that has consistently flouted the requirements of the Constitution, consistently ignored the calls, the decision, the resolution of this House passed last year to amend the Fiscal Management and Accountability Act, and then ignored the bill, which was an amendment to the Constitution, adding these constitutional offices where they had been omitted from the Schedule 3A. And in spite of this infringement of the Constitution, we are being asked to approve a budget. In other words, join the government in breaking the law. We are being asked to join the government in breaking the law. Mr. Speaker, maybe I should add that just in case there is some question as to time or the ability of the government to amend the relevant tables, I notice, and I'm not trying to be malicious here, but I noticed that on page 398 of these estimates, there is a category which I hadn't noticed before, obviously it was there, but it now has resources alongside it for the year 2013, and that item is called, under Agency Code 01, under the Office of the President, Office of the First Lady. It's been added, and there's a figure there. In other words, it seems that the government has its priorities a little skewed. Okay? I'm not saying this shouldn't be there, but I'm saying just as this could have been added, you have a First Lady. I'm not sure what the office does, by the way. Okay? I'm not sure what it does, but let's not dwell on that for now. The fact is, it's been added. It hasn't caused a crisis in the Ministry of Finance. It hasn't caused a collapse in our debt status or anything like that. It's been added, and we are being asked to find money for it. In the same way, the constitutional offices, in addition to the ERC, should have been reflected in this section of the estimates. And the question that has to be asked is, does the minister have a right? Does the minister have a right? And is the government in order to ignore the constitutional requirements and at the same time ask us to approve monies for them? Mr. Speaker, there is absolutely no reason why these requirements could not have been dealt with. You note that last year, I'm sure you will remember, the distinguished Minister of Home Affairs and our very how should I say, energetic Honorable Minister for Housing and Tourism, or acting on tourism and so forth, had a lot to say, in addition to the Minister of Finances, they usually supporting of these matters, when we cut the amounts for Kano and state planning, on grounds that the Auditor General had properly pointed out that these things should not have been where they were, and we were not prepared to approve monies for them. I'm happy to say that this year, I note that the funds for Kano, the Customs Anti-Narcotics Unit, have been reduced to zero, okay, under this subsidy, and presumably funded in the way it should have been funded in the first instance, and I think I noticed the same for state planning. I don't know whether I'm making sense, Mr. Speaker. Well, just in case, because if you can get economics, you can't understand the difference between a question and a comment. Those that can't understand the difference between a regressive tax and a luxury tax, then one needs to make sure as you go along that you are being followed. This is a simple exercise. We are saying, Mr. Speaker, that until such time as the minister comes and talks to us on this matter, and it isn't a surprise to them, because you remember that I read to you the fact that these issues were raised when we had the tripartite meeting with the President and his advisors, and the excuse they made at the time was that those corrections in terms of the Schedule 3 required first a constitutional amendment. Well, we agreed with them on that, and we subsequently effected that constitutional amendment. Okay? Nothing stops the minister from including these items in the estimates. And when he sees his way, well, I am interested to know that a lawyer, or Attorney General could find, Mr. Speaker, that a procedural matter to do with a constitutional requirement does not warrant attention. Okay? So I'm speaking about the substance of the estimate.
Okay, on the law, Mr. Greenidge, to make his presentation without interruption or hindered.
So, Mr. Speaker, the Constitution requires that these estimates come to us differently prepared and differently presented. And we would like to know how the government proposes to do that, because at this point in time, it cannot attract our support because it is unconstitutional. We had also discussed, Mr. Speaker, drawn to the attention of the President and his advisors, that several constitutional offices remain unfilled, or the offices, such as the ERC, were not properly or fully established. So that is true. The Ombudsman's Office, of the Ombudsman's Office, there are issues in relation to the Public Procurement Committee. Incidentally, the PPP is the only party not to have submitted a list of nominees for this particular body. And so that is another dimension that had been raised, and I think we need to get answers, maybe at the Committee of Supply, so that some decision could be taken on this side as to how to deal with the government's request. I will also draw to your attention, Mr. Speaker, as you will be aware, that this House passed both a resolution and a bill. Well, sorry. It passed a resolution pertaining to the extra budgetary agencies. And it specifically called upon the minister in relation to those very contentious agencies which seem to be used as a device for bypassing this House, entities collecting state revenues and using state revenues in a manner that is less than transparent, in a manner that seek deliberately to deny this House its role of overseeing and reviewing the expenditure requests of the country and looking at the priorities. So NISIL, GGMC, the Lotto Fund, the use of the funds from the 2005 floods, the Cricket World Cup, the hosting of Carifesta 10, and the ICC 2020 tournament. All of these items were the subject of a resolution by this House. And without going through the details of the resolution, let me just remind colleagues, Mr. Speaker, that in relation to those agencies, the decision was that the entities which, as of February of 2012, I emphasize this because we have since had a mad rush to, on the other side, to lay annual reports and a whole set of things. But the resolution was clear. It says, if these entities, which were supposed to have laid reports before this House, audited accounts, and other reports, if by February of 2012 those reports had not been laid, those entities should be required, and the minister responsible in this case is the Minister of Finance, should have been required to channel all the funds other than the operating expenses that they had to the consolidated fund until such time as we would have looked at it and decided otherwise. Mr. Speaker, nothing appears to have happened whatsoever on that front. And yet we have a request for an appropriation bill, for approval of an appropriation bill. Again, having defied the House, the minister comes back to the House to demand that monies be provided for additional expenditures which in effect amount to more of the same. In other words, where part of the revenues of the state are diverted and managed without reference to the House. The problem, therefore, is the same as with the constitutional offices. And there is a fourth element that I need to mention, Mr. Speaker, that the bills which have been passed, at least two of them I understand, are with the President for signature. The time available by which that signature should have been effected, or a report concerning the President's reason for not signing, that time, I believe, has expired. And, Mr. Speaker, in such circumstances, again, I have a difficulty understanding how we could be expected to pass a budget when such fundamental breaches of the Constitution and of our own responsibilities have continued to take place. So that's a general background, Mr. Speaker. That's a general background. In his speech, the Minister of Finance made reference to 7 prerequisites, such as commitment to democracy, equal access, and so forth, which prerequisites were highlighted in the 2012 budget. Political dialogue, which is supposed to be part of those that package, has or would have provided the opportunity for the minister, and I'm sure that he's not surprised, not to be arriving at a position in the Committee of Supply where preconditions, prerequisites, concerns about legality and constitutional acceptability would loom large. Those discussions could have removed this block, or remove the need for us to try and deal with that at the last minute. And here we are, they've yet to be attended. Public pledges to political dialogue by the government fill the airwaves, even as officials charged with such dialogue on the government side once again refuse either to provide information or to fix meetings in the context of a series of meetings rather than a last-minute meeting before the consideration of the estimates. The question of equal access, which was also one of the things mentioned by the Minister, is an interesting one. Again, although it is much touted, it is clear that the government honors these things more in the breach than anything else. And the current outrage over allocations for TV and radio frequencies is a case in point, demonstrating the extent to which the government is contemptuous of public opinion and its constitutional obligations. Although the Parliament approved the establishment of a body to oversee the exercise, which should have been part of that allocation of frequencies, we find ourselves in a situation where the effect of a decision taken after the House passed the bill, but before it was assented to, leaves us in a situation where equal access is certainly what did not take place. So that is a concern. But what I was saying earlier, Mr. Speaker, is that the bills passed by the House seem to lie unsigned because these political and constitutional issues that I have mentioned, these political and constitutional issues are regarded by the government in a very peculiar light. And I say peculiar because this is a government that oftentimes claims to have been the catalyst for a return to democracy in Guyana. And we find ourselves in a situation where the President believes that he has no obligation to assign to bills which his party doesn't approve, which his party can't approve on their own because they are in a house in which they are in a minority. And for as long as they are a minority, they're supposed to consult with that minority and to seek the support of the minority by the support of the majority in order to have the legislation and the measures that they have in mind passed. They eschew that obligation and demand the rights of a majority, although they hold a minority in the House. So we have a number of things. There's also the case of the Minister of Finance and the minister who claims to have been advised by the Attorney General, and I have no doubt to believe that he wasn't, in which decisions taken by this House concerning expenditures, including those under the contingencies, out of the contingencies fund, that did not meet the criteria set out in the Fiscal Management and Accountability Act, were approved, and funds not approved under the Appropriation Act were spent. We would like to know how the government proposes to resolve that conundrum, because it is an important issue, again, in terms of whether it is the House that has the responsibility for approving expenditure, or the Minister of Finance by himself, or the Minister of Finance and the Attorney General. In the light of these matters, Mr. Speaker, what I would call sins of omission as well as sins of commission, you would have thought that the Honourable Minister of Finance would recognize the prudence of being perhaps a little circumspect in his presentation. I was particularly caught by the overture in the budget. I think on the second page, well, certainly within the first 5 minutes of his presentation, an overture that I think was provocative, if not arrogant. It was a tirade against the opposition parties for a variety of perceived sins facilitated by the constitutional, what he calls, one-seat majority, by which the House passed motions, and I quote, Mr. Speaker, or bills that defy reason and collide with the Constitution. Mr. Speaker, up to now, after over a year of debate, neither the Attorney General or the Minister have explained why the constitutional offices are not all reflected like the ERC in the estimates, and they have the gall to speak of proposals that conflict with the Constitution. There is no more obvious conflict with the Constitution than the estimates before us today that defy Article 222A. And then there was reference, Mr. Speaker, to the undesirable legislative actions. Oh, well, these, sorry, no, they're not your words. I'm wanting to say that these undesirable legislative actions to which the minister referred, the ones that defy reason and collide with the Constitution, include the attempts by the House to correct the abuses as reflected in the Fiscal Management and Accountability Act. Presumably that is one of the things that collides with reason. The interesting thing is that the minister himself laid an order here after the first motion that removed the audit department from the schedule, and subsequently nothing has happened in relation to that office as regards the Constitution. So, Mr. Speaker, these political descendants of Dr. Jagan, who speak in hushed terms about his struggle for independence and the rights of the majority, somehow see no contradiction between Dr. Jagan's professed principles and behavior, which accepts a majority. In this case, they are accepting a majority decision only if that majority comprises PPP members. Only only if the majority comprises PPP members. The president's party, having lost at the polls, lost its majority at the polls, goes to the courts, in effect to authorize them to continue to behave as though the PPP had won a majority of seats. That's the point. That's the point. You don't have a majority and you want the powers to behave as a majority. So that's the point, in case you missed it. Okay? So the president's party, that is not a majority, madam. You have to have a look at the dictionary. Look at that. That is a plurality. Have a look at the dictionary. Instead of shouting, read the dictionary. You have a computer, go online. Okay? Under the current dispensation, Mr. Speaker, the President only signs bills, it seems, presented by his party. And that is the new democracy that the PPP has heralded in for us. It is loser-take-all politics. That's what I call loser-take-all politics. You lose a majority and you exercise the functions of a majority. Many of those who stood alongside the PPP when the PPP was fighting itself for democracy would have never expected this behavior. Even under the PPP, it was expected that the simple majority would be recognized with no distinction between the majority of 50 and a majority of 1. The basis for the parliamentary cooperation, Mr. Speaker, the basis for parliamentary cooperation has to be a resolution to these issues pertaining to
so the budget is a good budget.
pertaining to the budget itself. Mr. Speaker, as regards well, you can dream. As regards the measures themselves, a look at the estimates suggests a number of interesting facts. We see, for example, what appear to be the movement in numbers, that is from one year to the next, and from budgeted figures to revised figures, that suggest that in some places, especially as regards GDP, you see the manipulation of the numbers in order to attain growth rates. Well, thank you very much, Honourable Minister. If you look at the figures for agriculture over the last 4 years, you will see what I'm talking about. In fact, if you look at the balance of payments figures, especially the movement of non-factor services, you will see what I'm talking about. So that's one dimension, Mr. Speaker. And when one looks at loans and the borrowing by the government, the movement from one year to the next also poses a problem in the sense that the figures posted in the budget, at the time of the budget, seem to vary so much from the outturn at the end of the year. I would suggest either that sometimes, as the World Bank was arguing, planning is very poor. Because if within the year, it's March now, for example, the year comes to an end, the budget preparation comes to an end in December. Sorry, the revision is effected at the end of December. And if at that time such wide movements can be seen, then if it isn't bad planning, it has to be cynicism in providing figures just to keep the other side of the house quiet. In relation to debt, Mr. Speaker, the ministers claim about PPP stewardship in this regard is a claim that turns out not to be warranted. At the end of 2010, Guyana's total external indebtedness, according to his figures, stood at over $1 billion. By the end of 2012, that figure had risen to $1.358 billion. That's $380 million increase within 2 years. And the bulk of those loans associated with the debts were associated with projects, many of which we have a difficulty, and of course, one of them would have been Skeldon. I mention this to say to you, Mr. Speaker, that the expansion of debt needs to be informed by some criterion formula. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I know you have nothing to apologize for, and these are part, I think, par for the course, as it were. Mr. Speaker, I was on the question of debt and raising a concern that one would have expected to see the minister, or one would like to see the minister, since he hasn't done so far, provide some guidelines for the contracting of debt in future, especially since the rate at which it is increasing is significant. May I just remind you, Mr. Speaker, since this is an issue that the other side speaks a lot about, that the volume of debt contracted by this government in the last 10 years has exceeded the total volume of debt contracted by its two predecessors, the PNC as well as Dr. Jagan's government. So it's not something that's insignificant. There's a large amount of external indebtedness here, and it needs to be noted that to the extent that the debts are spent upon activities such as Skeldon, which don't yield the returns when they're supposed to yield them, we will end up having to pay more taxes, including the VAT, than we need to do. So that's the importance of the point that's being made here. Mr. Speaker, in view of the time, I'm going to perhaps be a little eclectic in dealing with other issues. Let me say that one of the areas that needed attention, and we would have liked to see a more detail, more care on it, has to do with the treatment of youths. Under the government of Dr. Jagan, as well as the PNC government of Mr. Burnham, the country was faced with, I mention that because it's not a new problem, it's a perennial problem, but they had initiatives, both of them, to try and deal with the problem of the large and growing youth unemployment. And in the case of the Dr. Jagan, you had, of course, the MMA. That was a major effort made to tackle unemployment. And subsequently, of course, there was the question of the Youth Corps National Service, MMA, for example, on the PNC side, to deal with the question of unemployment. We have no similar initiative of any import or of any worth in relation to the current budget before us, at a time when the unemployment problem is probably even greater than it was in those times. And I would urge the government to have a look. We ourselves had made a proposal, again, Mr. Speaker, when speaking to the government. The President seemed much interested in an initiative that we were proposing, which would work on, first of all, providing immediate employment, which would at the same time deal with the environmental decay that is taking place around us, and it will combine it with training for the young in relation to a range of skills, including entrepreneurial skills. This was a proposal. The President seemed responsive. At the time, it seemed that we could go forward if we could discuss the modalities. Nothing has happened. It seems to have died a death. Elsewhere, countries faced by unemployment amongst youth of the same magnitude, they are putting in place major measures, including measures for helping young people to get apprenticeship in numbers. The point is that when these proposals that the minister mentions are looked at, they are insignificant relative to the numbers affected. If I might jump to the question of old age pensions, Mr. Speaker, the old age pension arrangements, I think, are something of concern to us. After discussing this again with the government last year, and the government having indicated in first instance that an interim payment would take it to 10,000, we are appalled to find that a year later, the government cannot even see it fit to move to 15,000 at a time when revenue levels have increased up substantially and significantly, when the monies collected by VAT, from the VAT, for example, are significant over the preceding year. And yet, with resources available to them, the minister boasting about the size of the budget, you have this mean-spirited response to a major need, a major group, a group that is challenged. We have, at the same time, if you look, Mr. Speaker, we were speaking in relation to VAT and the expenditure of monies on basic items. The movement of prices for food and for medicines over the year 2012 as a whole have gone up by 10 percentage points. This is more than the 5% paid to across the board to public sector workers. So the issue here, Mr. Speaker, is a very important one. We are saying that a variety of concerns have been raised. A number of issues mentioned by the minister have not dealt adequately with the needs of the poor. And I know the minister is going to cite what he's proposing in relation to NIS and water, not NIS, water and electricity. The point is in relation to those areas that not all pensioners will benefit from them because of the way that the arrangements have been set out. So that is going to be the problem there. As regards my final set of points, Mr. Speaker, Gaisuko and GPL again emerging as a major factor here. I was at pains, Mr. Speaker, to point out the importance of institutional reform, the importance of organizational change, depoliticization of our major corporations. This again was the subject of discussion with the government. I'm emphasizing this, Mr. Speaker, because making suggestions to the government is almost like throwing water on a duck's back. They ignore them. You have numbers in the estimates that suggest that output levels will move positively and significantly from one place, from one year to the next. And the point I was making earlier that seemed to have upset our colleagues on the other side is this. To the extent that you only show the numbers increasing, but the factors that are supposed to enhance the output are not there. In other words, the investment levels don't seem to be going in that direction. Okay? The reform of the corporations is non-existent. Okay? Depoliticization is non-existent, which means no change is going to be effected. And when the minister comes to us and tells us that Gaisuko will only require $1 billion in transfer this year, we don't believe him, Mr. Speaker. We don't believe him because the minister has already established a reputation for being in love, specifically with the contingencies fund. So no sooner will we have passed these votes, then he will come back. You're not in love? He is enamored, Mr. Speaker. He is enamored with the contingencies fund. And the attorneys general, auditors general, over the last 6 years at least, have drawn our attention to what I would regard as serial abuse of these contingencies funds. Serious abuse. Up to 2010, the estimates, the 2010 Auditor General's report, attest to that, specifically. Attest to that. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, that is a matter that the minister needs to address. We don't believe you. We don't believe you. You're going to come back for more money. The 11 billion to GPL, Mr. Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, in response to our demands for reform that will justify the monies and give us the assurance that they wouldn't be asking for more money, he gave us I don't know what to call it, a plan of some type. And here we are, a year later, they're asking for 11.2 billion beyond the amounts approved last year, which was 6 billion. We have here, Mr. Speaker, a black hole. Okay? The combined sugar and GPL are a black hole in which resources of taxpayers are being dumped And this is taking place at the expense, yes, it's a black hole because there is, the only point in putting money there is if you're going to fix it. And since you've made no attempt to fix it, in relation to Kaisuko, Mr. Speaker, we are promised a plan. We promised a plan. Okay? Mr. Speaker, let me conclude. I never mentioned sugar workers. Sugar workers are your problem. If you believe that that is the thing. The opportunity, Mr. Speaker. Well, you didn't show much interest in them in looking at the NIS because up to now there's been no proposal. The President promised that the government's views on the NIS would be laid in this House by September of 2012. We haven't seen that. And instead of fixing a board that has given away a lot of investment income, we just see a transfer of 125 million to the NIS. That can't fix the NIS. Mr. Speaker, what I want to conclude is to say that the financial position of the government has been quite favorable compared to previous years. That is the case now, that's my reading of the minister. In spite of this, Mr. Speaker, the opportunity to fix management and political problems has been missed due to a political obsession about the no dialogue. The measures demonstrate continued political denial and the ignoring of public concerns in areas such as corruption, which in fact are getting worse, and nepotism, especially as reflected in the story of the frequencies, is again getting worse. I'm not going to call any names, but you know who I'm talking about. I believe, yes. So, Mr. Speaker, the program allocates resources primarily to the privileged few. And if you look at the allocation of the capital expenditure, you will see a dramatic reduction in the quantity of resources made available to agriculture. No logic. But yet you have agriculture doing better this year. I don't know if you noticed, but I notice you're not shouting now. So, agriculture, you got Transport and Harvest Department cut drastically at a time when they have major vessels that seem to have high operating costs. So there are a number of issues here, Mr. Speaker, and the point is, the budget has been framed in relatively easy financial circumstances, but the measures, especially the relief provided to the poor and the vulnerable, are far less than the figures suggest we could afford, especially when compared to the sweeteners provided by the government to their friends and cronies. There's a certain meanness of spirit underlying the proposals, which the Minister of Finance has tried to hide by various tricks and sleights of hand. What in the fairground in England is called smoke and mirrors. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.